Honey, you wanna go outside? You wanna go outside? Hey homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today we are talking about making kiwi wine, and I know that probably sounds odd. I had good success with making a hard apple cider this fall. And I used to make fruit wines quite a bit, and I haven't done anything in probably about the last 10 years. And I had a freezer full of the hardy kiwis, so the little small kiwis that aren't fuzzy. And the first time I got a good crop off of the tree, I sold some of them. I made some of them into a strawberry kiwi jam, which was really lovely. And then I had about a gallon of them, a little more than that, that I stuffed into freezer bags thinking I would use them in smoothies, and I never did. And so I ran across this bag as I was cleaning out freezers, and I thought, I wonder if you could make kiwi wine. And I have a book on fruit wine making, and so I looked it up, and of course there was a kiwi wine recipe in there because he has a recipe for just about everything, including things like carrot wine and parsnip wine. And it's supposed to be just a nice, lovely kind of white wine. And so I thought, why not? I had all the gear out from making the cider, so I thought, let's try making a kiwi wine. And then a local honey place that's not too far from me had a customer appreciation day where you could bring your own bottles and buy honey for a really good price. And so I drove out there and bought a couple of quarts of honey. And so I had a lot of honey on hand and I got a really good price on it. And I thought, what about instead of just a kiwi wine, if I made a kiwi mead? And so this is a kiwi mead, and the alcohol content in it is unknown. I did add a certain amount of sugar to this, and I took initial specific gravity reading, but I don't think the kiwi fruit itself had really started to break down and release a lot of its sugars when I took that reading. And so it's hard to know. Basically, if that reading was correct, this is really more like a hard cider than it is a wine. The alcohol content in it is going to be under 10%, but I'm assuming that there was probably quite a bit of sugar released from those kiwis that I wasn't necessarily able to account for. And so who knows? This is somewhere in between a mead / hard cider / kiwi wine. And right now it's been aging in 1 gallon bottles for a little over a month. I'm just getting ready to rack it into actual wine bottles. And then it's going to need to sit on a shelf for probably at least 6 months before you drink it. So it's going to take a while before we actually get to the taste test part of this video. I'll do a follow-up in a while. But I thought I'd bring you along and show you the basics of fruit wine making in this video. It's a really fun project, and I'm hoping for good results. I had 2 gallons and then enough for about another quart or so. These are 500 milligram bottles. And so this one, I don't have an airlock on it. And so what I've been doing is just releasing the pressure out of here as it ferments every couple of days. And I can actually see it bubbling right now. And so this is what's called the secondary ferment. The primary ferment happened in the big plastic jug, and then the secondary ferment is happening in these bottles with an airlock on top. And then once we put it into wine bottles, it will continue to age in there. Meads often ferment slower than regular straight sugar wines. And so it'll be interesting to see how this turns out. But this will be nice because when I rack that stuff into wine bottles, a lot of times you end up with like a little random amount left over where you don't have quite enough for a bottle. And I'm hoping I'll be able to top that off with this so that none of it will go to waste, and I'll probably get a little bit of extra. But let's see if this has any pressure in it. Yep, just a tiny little psst. And can you see the bubbles in there? Woo! Making sure this isn't going to actually overflow. So clearly there's still a lot of fermentation happening in this bottle. So just a really fun winter experiment. We'll see what we get. I can smell this right now. It smells acidic. It smells definitely very yeasty. Yeah, so kiwi wine. Let's get started. So here are our frozen kiwis. I actually had 2 bags of them. I'll just leave the recipe up here on the screen for a while. Gave everything a good rinse to rinse off any little particles. I did a half and half of this with sugar and honey. So this is a couple of pounds of sugar and then our quart jar of honey, which was a little over 2.5 pounds. And then into that, I'm also adding a couple of gallons of water. And I'm just going to bring that up to a pasteurization temperature in order to kill any wild yeast that are on here without having to add Camden tablets or that type of thing. You can see the kiwis are still frozen at this point. And the recipe for this will be in the description below for a 1 gallon batch. And then you can just do the math if you've got extra kiwis. And then I did end up, once everything had thawed out and it started to simmer, I did end up stick blending this a little bit to break some of that fruit up, because those outer shells on those kiwis are pretty waxy, and I was afraid that they weren't going to break down and actually release their juice in the fermentation unless I did that. So to this, I'm adding some yeast nutrient, some pectic enzyme, a little bit of acid blend. I did a combination of acid blend and lemon juice, and then a little bit of wine tannin. So this is everything measured out into this container. And then here's the half of lemon that I also added as an acid. So I did the rind from the lemon and then the juice of 1 lemon to add to the mix. And then here I'm blooming my yeast. And because this ends up being about a 2.5 gallon batch, I just went ahead and used the entire yeast packet. These can brew up to 5 gallons of brew. And then once everything had pasteurized for the length of time I needed it to, I ladled everything into these wine bags. And some people like these, some people don't. Some people feel like there isn't enough circulation with the fruit when they're in the bag like this, but I like to be able to pull all of the fruit out easily instead of having to sift it through any kind of a strainer. This was a little bit tedious because it was a lot of volume, and so I'm having to hold it with one hand and ladle with another. And then I'm not going to add anything else to this until everything has fully cooled down. So this is way too hot at this point to add the yeast. And I don't show pitching the yeast and all of the other nutrients and extras into this brew, but that happens after this has come down to essentially about 90 degrees. But you can see here, most of those kiwis have been broken up with a stick blender because I really wanted to release as much juice as possible. And I can't remember where I got these wine bags, if I got them from a brewer supply store or if I just ordered them on Amazon. Here's the initial specific gravity, which is at 1.07. And then this is after fermentation. So this has been going for about a week. I did have to change out the bucket that I originally had. The fermentation bucket that I had was really old, and the rubber seal where the spigot was had completely gotten crusty and hard, and so I was getting leaking. And so very last minute, I had to stop and find a different 5 gallon bucket, clean it out well, sanitize it with Star San, and then pour everything into that instead. So there was a little bit of scrambling that happened, but this has been brewing for about a week, and the seal on this bucket was not 100% tight. So even though I had a airlock on here, because this bucket wasn't tight, I don't think the airlock really did much in terms of bubbling. But I'm checking here to see if we are fully fermented out at this point. And you can see how cloudy that is. So there's still a ton of suspended yeast in there. My kingdom for a turkey baster that doesn't drip. So checking my specific gravity. And I want this to be at 1 or less. And sometimes it can be less than 1 depending on what's happened. But at this point, I'm clearly completely fermented out. There are no more sugars available in that mix. So I am officially completely dry. I had set the kiwi fruit in a strainer just to get all of the juice. And then I did let this sit for, I think, at least 24 hours to let all of that yeast particles settle out. And then now I'm doing what's called racking. There's a lot of dead yeast at the bottom of this bucket and other detritus from the fruit. And so I am trying hard to pull off the wine without disturbing the what are called the lees that are in the bottom of the bucket. And I go more in depth in this in the hard cider video that I have. And so if you want to know more about how this works, watch that video where I give a lot more detail. but I'm just carefully siphoning our Kiwi wine into these 1 gallon glass containers that can be fitted with an airlock. And I stopped a little shy of where I wanted to be on these, just because sometimes it's really hard to judge exactly where your levels are going to end up, and I didn't want to overflow it. And so you'll see in these the difference between video after they've been sitting. I clearly topped them off. So I stop about here, and everything has been sanitized. I can't emphasize this enough. I use a acid sanitizer that is a no-wash sanitizer, and the bottles have been sanitized. The turkey baster has been sanitized. The bucket was sanitized before I started. The wand that I'm siphoning with has been sanitized. It is really critical that everything be thoroughly, thoroughly sanitized before you start this, or you run the risk of something nasty getting in there and ruining your blend. And the less alcohol in the mix, the more important that is. Alcohol, as it forms, will start killing off things. But in the early part of the fermentation, when things aren't very alcoholic yet, you really need to make sure that everything is sanitized. So there's our lees left in the bottom of the bucket. This just got tossed. And then here are our 2 gallons with our airlock. After these 2 extra bottles had settled out, I topped off those 1 gallon containers and ended up with just 1 of these instead of 2. And then this is what it looks like after about a month and a half of settling out. Look how much more clear this is. And so those airlocks have been releasing gas, with the exception of this bottle that I've been burping manually. And now it's time to rack into wine bottles. So after sanitizing all of my gear really well with the Star San, I have here a siphon, and then I also have a bottle filler. So I'm going to take off the airlock on these 1 gallon containers, and I'm just going to siphon my wine into a large container in order to get it off of the lees that are in these gallon jugs. And I was having problems, and I just ordered some new tubing. This siphon is a 3/8 inch diameter, and the hose that I have is supposed to be 3/8 inch, but I think it's slightly larger than it actually says it is. Either that or it's just been sitting for a really long time, because it's well over 10 years old. And you can see the air that I'm getting in this. I should not be getting air in this siphon. And so the whole idea when you're racking wine is to avoid introduction of a lot of oxygen, because it can cause off flavors. And so this was really frustrating, but I did the best that I could. And so I racked both of these 1 gallon containers into this large pot. And then I could have put things into bottles and then pasteurized the bottles, which is what I did in the video for the hard cider. But I opted to use potassium sorbate in this particular batch instead. Potassium sorbate is a stabilizer that will kill the active yeast that's in there. And that way you can add a little bit of back sweetening in order to get the sugar content back up again, which helps with flavors. Really dry wine, you don't tend to taste the fruit or the honey, honestly, that's in this. And so I wanted to back sweeten it just slightly. And I didn't necessarily follow the correct directions for stabilizing this. Normally you would stir it into your brew and then let it sit for 24 hours and then add the back sweetening and bottle. And I just didn't have the time and energy to do this. I had friends coming over for dinner. I was also making French onion soup, and I just didn't want to fiddle with this for that length of time. And so I've got my honey, a little bit of sugar to back sweeten. I think I did 3 tablespoons of each, and then a teaspoon of potassium sorbate, which is enough to stabilize 2 gallons. I did have to heat that in the microwave just slightly in order to get that honey to fully dissolve. And so this got heated for a total of about a minute in the microwave to get everything to dissolve. I'm pouring that into my brew that I've racked off of the lees, giving that a good stir, making sure that everything is fully incorporated, and also degassing any CO2 that was in that smaller bottle that got added by giving this a gentle stir. And then I am tasting this just for sweetness. This is going to taste really raw. It's going to taste kind of yeasty. It's not going to be great at this stage, but you can get a sense of the sweetening and whether or not it's where you like. I don't want things super sweet, so I kind of went with a semi-dry here. And then this is the
same tubing, but this is what's called a filling wand. And the idea here is that there's a little bit of a spring-loaded thing at the end that when it's pressed in, the wine can flow. And when it's not pressed in, it stops the flow so that you can easily go from one bottle to another. They're really great when they work well. I was having all kinds of problems with this, both with the air incorporated into the line, and so it would start to fill and then it would stop. And then I was also having problems with just the little spring or valve or whatever it is at the bottom of this actually working correctly. Wine bottles have that indented, inverted bow in there, and I kept having problems with it not sitting correctly. And so, like, I was going to show you this all the way to the top, and then it stopped running before I could get there. But basically, you let the fluid go all the way to the very top of the bottle, and then you pull that filling rack out, and then as soon as you pull it out, it drops the liquid to just about where you want it to be, which is where you see here. This is a corker, and so I had some very old corks that I used to cork 5 of these bottles, and then the other 5 just went in bale tops because I didn't have enough wine bottles. Normally you soak your corks for a period of time. I did not soak these for as long as they probably needed, and they were really old, so I was getting some disintegration here. But here's the finished wine that just needs to age for about 6 months. And I'm excited to try this with you guys in July to give you an update on how it came out. Worst case scenario, I will make it into sangria in the summer. So have you guys ever tried home brewing wine? What's the most interesting fruit you've ever made wine out of? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.